Hello everyone, and welcome to Lancelot's Nerd Corner, where I'm proud to present another 6-scale figure review. Today, we'll be taking a look at the Batman by InArt. But this time, we'll be trying something different. Since I already reviewed the Hot Toys Batman relatively recently, earlier this year, I felt it would be a bit redundant to go through the exact same version of the exact same character in the same way. So instead, we'll be taking a comparative look at both of them, where I'll be pointing out any similarities or differences between them, and at the end, I'll reveal which of them I personally think is best. I did already review and compare the head sculpt specifically, so if you'd like to check that out first, you can click the link on the top right or down in the description. Now, let's go over the figures themselves, starting with the bodies, which both have similar weights. InArt, however, does feel a little bit heavier, as it seems like there's more padding around the abdomen. Overall, I also like the InArt body proportions more. The shoulders just look more broad and the torso a bit slimmer. They're pretty much the same height from toe to bat ears, but because of the different proportions, InArt's Batman just looks a little bit shorter. And in terms of articulation, I do enjoy posing both. They have similar joint movements and range of motion, but again, because of the smaller armor pieces on the InArt, you can squeeze out a little bit more range of motion. Taking a closer look at the Batsuit, I think it's best to start with the chest, as it sets the tone pretty well for the rest of the figure comparison. InArt's chest is a bit smaller and, in my opinion, more accurately proportioned. They also have different textures. Hot Toys has a more clearly traced crosshatch pattern, whereas InArt's is more subtle and realistic. Both are attached to the suit with Velcro and need to be removed for cape detachment and attachment, and I do want to note the chests on both figures may be improperly positioned from its original out-of-the-box positioning, because I did have to remove and reattach them myself. Hot Toys has a bit more of a weathered appearance with all the rust around the edges, whereas InArt's paint finish looks a bit more realistic. And there's a big thing that needs to be mentioned about the Hot Toys paint app, which really becomes a recurring theme. The figure has this shiny and polished finish, which I think takes away from the realism, as it overshadows the weathering details. Whereas InArt's Batman has a way more realistic paint finish all over, making it look less toyetic than Hot Toys. The bat symbol on both are made of die-cast, but again, Hot Toys is way more weathered, especially with the scratches. And both are removable, but InArt's is way more loose. It might just be an issue with my specific copy of the figure, but it feels like the magnet is not as strong as it should be. Lastly, the way the cape inserts underneath the chest is also more accurate on InArt's, as it doesn't overlap one another like with Hot Toys. Speaking of which, the cape I think is the most visibly different aspect between the two figures. The biggest difference is the material. InArt uses some variation of a PVC fabric, and you can tell as it has that clear shine and smooth appearance that really mimics the look of real leather. It's also double layered, so it looks and feels heavier. Hot Toys, on the other hand, uses a very thin nylon polyester fabric that honestly makes the cape my least favorite aspect of this figure. Both capes have stitching details in pretty much the same way, as well as similarly weathered areas that are just painted differently and have different styles of weathering. The InArt cape also has way more wires, numbering 5 in total, 4 going down the length of the cape and 1 along the entire bottom lining. And overall, it's a bit more dynamic and realistic looking because of that, especially when compared to Hot Toys' only 3 wires. All in all, I think InArt has the far superior cape, but Hot Toys does have an alternative cape that I think is so much better than the stock, but because InArt does not offer their own alternative cape, I only wanted to compare it to the stock Hot Toys cape. The shoulder pads on the InArt look slightly smaller than Hot Toys. It's not as wide, and while both have really well sculpted and accurate details, as mentioned earlier, InArt I think has the more realistic paint app. And honestly, that statement is true for most, if not all, other aspects of these two Batsuits, so I apologize in advance if I sound too repetitive. You can also see the difference in color, as Hot Toys is much darker black, whereas InArt's is more of a matte gray, and in my opinion more accurate. Similarly to the chest, they both might be slightly out of place, as again they're both velcroed onto the undersuit, and I had to adjust them a few times when articulating for certain poses. The other two armor pieces on the arms, the bicep pads and gauntlets, are pretty much the same story as the shoulders. Both have great sculpt work and details, but InArt's paint finish is just better in my opinion, and both pieces on the InArt are slightly smaller. The gauntlet on the InArt Batman also feel tighter on the undersuit, so they don't slide around as much as the Hot Toys, and don't get too far away from the hands. Speaking of which, InArt provides a total of 10 hands, whereas Hot Toys provides only 9. Both companies offer pairs of fist, relaxed, grapnel holding, and individual palm gestures. The difference is that Hot Toys has a pair of utility holding gestures, whereas InArt only has one, as well as an individual card holding and sticky bomb gun holding gesture. My previous comments about the differences in sculpt work and paint app still remain true for this aspect of the figure as well, but the hands have the most extreme differences in that regard. The sculpt work of the InArt hands are much more detailed and clearer, which you can see in the sculpted texture throughout the whole glove, the more well-defined details on the fingers, and the way more realistic creases on the palm, and honestly much more. And the paint app is way too smooth and polished on the Hot Toys with almost no weathering whatsoever, whereas InArt's has a tons of dirt, dust, and grime all over. However, one great thing about the Hot Toys hands is the inclusion of the small tasers on the fingertips, and they're also just not as stiff as the InArt hands. The abdomen area is very similar between both figures in terms of size and proportions of the panels. It's just that the panels on the InArt Batman look more sharply defined and they don't stick out forward as much. The stitching details are also way bigger and more obvious on the Hot Toys Batman. The same is true about the panels on the legs, except the stitching details are also clearer on the InArts. But the knee pads are less obvious and more subtle. The open weave pattern on the side of the legs is also slightly different, with the InArts being a bit smaller and thinner, and in my opinion, a bit cleaner. Lastly, for both the abdomen and legs, InArt finished it off with a light coat of weathering to make it look dusty, and that really enhances the realism for me. The belt is probably the most similar aspect between the figures. There are only some small differences in the size of some of the pouches. The belt itself is also much taller on the Hot Toys, and the pouch on the left side of InArt's belt is much bigger than Hot Toys. The sculpt work is really good on both, and there's less of that polished shine on the Hot Toys belt. And the holsters for the sticky bomb gun on the right side are also quite similar. The biggest difference between them doesn't necessarily have to do with the belt itself, but rather the fact that for the InArt Batman, you have to put the belt and holster on the figure yourself. I personally found this frustrating as they ended up quite loose and I constantly have to keep retightening them, and there were several times when the buckle on the holster came undone. This does honestly make the InArt Batman less enjoyable to pose at times, as it does get frustrating. And I may sound like an entitled crybaby collector when I say this, but for the price of this figure, I really feel like we shouldn't have to assemble it ourselves, especially when that was not advertised. Last but not least, the boots have a few of the same differences, but a few others as well. The Hot Toys has more sculpted creasing on the top half of the boot, whereas InArt's has way more on the shoe itself. Like the cowl, the leather grains are also sculpted differently, and in terms of the shoe details, they're quite similar except for the laces, which I think are more defined on the Hot Toys, and they're just painted a different color. Like the rest of the Hot Toys Batsuit, you can unfortunately see that polished paint finish, whereas, as always, InArt's is more weathered and realistic. And there's much less of that yellow paint on the top of the boots of the InArt. The release of these two figures marks a momentous occasion in the 1/6 community. Two 1/6 powerhouses go head-to-head on the exact same version of the same character in a relatively short amount of time. This, to my knowledge, has never happened before, so I'm just here to really enjoy both figures. And while I think both companies brought their A-game and put so much effort into their respective figures, if I had to choose one to crown as the best, I would have to say InArt. I personally prefer the weathering and paint finish throughout. I think the proportions are better and more accurate, and the cape is so much better in every way. But after taking a close look at both of these, I genuinely and honestly have to say I just love them both. This Hot Toys Batman was my figure of the year last year, and I'm almost certain this InArt Batman will be my figure of the year this year. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this comparison review helpful, please feel free to like and subscribe. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.